Master Sun writes in his last chapter of The Art of War that the far-sighted ruler thinks the situation through carefully. And I believe that by that standard, he would give the United States a very poor critique on our war in Afghanistan. Hello, my name is John LeMay and welcome to my basement war room. This video is one in a series entitled The Great Military Philosophers on Afghanistan, and today is the final talk on Sun Tzu and the Art of War. So today I'll discuss the last two chapters, chapters 12, Fires, and chapter 13, Intelligence, probably better translated as the use of spies. And then after that, I'll talk about the entire theme of calculations through the Art of War. And finally, I'll conclude by taking a look at how the United States did in its calculations in Afghanistan compared to the standard that Master Sun establishes in the Art of War. So before I jump into this, let me just make a little aside about the Ames translation. The Ames translation has part one, which is the 13 chapters of the Art of War that are in all the other translations. Then goes into a further two parts, parts 2 and 3, that include some perhaps an expanded version of the Art of War. I had intended to go through that sort of sequentially as I've gone through these talks 1 through 13, and then keep going to part 2 and 3 of Ames. But as I reviewed it, it's very much either the same as was covered in earlier chapters of the Art of War, or it's very fragmented and incomplete, like literally just parts of sentences here and there that are hard to get coherent thoughts out of. So for that reason, I'm not going to go into those. If I were to do it all again, I would have more intentionally integrated them, these later parts, into my discussions on 1 through 13. Okay, so that aside complete, let's jump right into the final two chapters of the Art of War, Fires and Intelligence. So, Fires and Intelligence here strike me as really warfighting functions from modern U.S. Army doctrine. Modern U.S. Army doctrine states that combat power is the 6 warfighting functions plus leadership and information. So here's the diagram. Mission, command, protection, movement, maneuver, intelligence, fire, sustainment. Those are warfighting functions. Integrated with leadership and information equals combat power. Now, let's take a look at what Master Sun has to say. He who uses fire to aid in the attack is powerful. This brings forth to me the idea of the integration of the warfighting functions increases combat power. So rather than just have infantry on infantry, Master Sun is saying, hey, if you integrate fire into that, then you're more powerful. And that's exactly what we're trying to pull out here in U.S. Army doctrine. Okay, Master Sun also writes that an army must understand the changes induced by the 5 kinds of incendiary attack and make use of logistical calculations to address them. This, to me, is really what the role of officers, both commissioned and non-commissioned, in the Army is. And yes, there's an element of direct leadership and leading soldiers in battle, but really it's to create combat power by understanding, planning, preparing the integration of all the warfighting functions so they integrate effectively. Saying, hey, 5 types of incendiary attack, logistical calculations, got to understand all that and how it's going to work together, then changes that will be induced by it. And that's the same with all the warfighting functions. We have to understand how to make all those calculations within them and how to integrate them successfully to create more combat power, not just a random disaster. And then finally, Master Sun here says, intelligence is the essence of warfare. It is what armies depend on in their every move. And while that's specific to intelligence, I think it also holds true to all the warfighting functions. They're all critical, and instead of just having infantry doing its own thing, well, infantry going forth in accordance with good intelligence is much more effective. Infantry with fires integrated, with proper sustainment, with good mission command is much more effective. So this generation of combat power is what we're trying to achieve. And it's not a new idea. Master Sun was pointing to it 2,300 years ago. Okay, so that's an overview of sort of the specific titles of the final two chapters of The Art of War. But let's look in now at the major theme, calculations. Okay, so The Art of War begins with Chapter 1, Estimates. And I would call it calculations, but let me take a quick quote from it. Thus do many calculations lead to victory and a few to defeat. And then it concludes with Chapter 13, Using Spies or Intelligence. The farsighted ruler thinks the situation through carefully. So Master Sun's not a fan of hubris. He has that trend running throughout the Art of War, and that is because he's writing as a reaction to unprofessional nobles wielding forces for hereditary, honor sort of driven reasons. And as China transformed into the Warring States period, he said, hey, this is not acceptable. There's serious consequences now to the use of military force, and we need serious professionals to wield our militaries, professionals that make calculations and think the situation through carefully. Let me read to you just a little bit more in depth of what he says in the first and last chapters of The Art of War. Okay, so from Chapter 1, Estimates, the general who wins a battle makes many calculations in his temple ere the battle is fought. The general who loses a battle makes but few calculations beforehand. Thus do many calculations lead to victory and few to defeat. Giles. Okay, and then in Chapter 13, at the end of The Art of War, thus the reason the far-sighted ruler and his superior commander conquer the enemy at every move and achieve success far beyond the reach of the common crowd is foreknowledge. Such foreknowledge cannot be gained from ghosts and spirits, induced by comparisons with the past, or verified by astrological calculations. It must come from people who know the enemy's situation.
Oh.
So, Master Sun is not a fan of hubris. He's a fan of serious calculations based on good and verified intelligence. Okay, so with that background of calculations now, let me talk a little bit about Afghanistan. Okay, before I jump into some of my points on Afghanistan, I'll give sort of three examples of potentially poor calculations. Let me contrast Master Sun's standard with what reportedly a Bush administration official stated, and this is more invasion of Iraq, but I think it really summarizes. It's a good contrast. So let me jump into it. So Master Sun's standard, and again, this is from Chapter 13. Thus it is said, the far-sighted ruler thinks the situation through carefully. The good commander explains it fully. If there is no advantage, do not move into action. If there is no gain, do not deploy the troops. If it is not crucial, do not send them into battle. A ruler cannot mobilize his armies in a rage. A commander cannot incite a battle in the heat of the moment. Move if it is to your advantage. Bide your time if it is not. A person in a fit of rage can be restored to good humor, and a person in the heat of passion can be restored to good cheer. But a state that has perished cannot be revived, and the dead cannot be brought back to life. Thus the far-sighted ruler approaches battle with prudence, and the good commander moves with caution. This is the way, Tao, to keep the state secure and preserve the army intact. From the Ames translation. Now let me contrast that with what supposedly an aide to President Bush told a reporter. So the aide to President Bush said, quote, guys like the reporter were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. End quote. Okay, so I think Master Sun is absolutely in the reality-based community. He is a fan of calculations, of of serious thought before taking military action. Now, this does bring forth a little bit of the tension between the art of war and the science of war. The sort of best interpretation I can give that quote from that supposed aide to President Bush is he's talking about initiative. And that's a thing. I mean, initiative, momentum, morale, all those are factors in war. But the art of war can only be employed successfully on the foundation of the science of war. And I think General Eisenhower really pulls this out in his famous quote that I'll paraphrase: "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything." In that quote, he's acknowledging, hey, we're going to have to change. As we fight, we're not going to be able to just execute the plan rote. We're going to have to react to the enemy, take the initiative. No plan is going to go according to plan. But planning is everything. Doing all those calculations beforehand, really understanding the enemy, the terrain, yourself, the entire situation very thoroughly is crucial to being able to then later on employ the art of war on that firm foundation of science. Okay, so in Afghanistan, the United States did not, in my opinion, live up to master-son standards. So let's talk let me give you three quick highlights of why not. So, bad assumptions, poor calculations. First, well, let me back up here. Okay, what is Afghanistan all about? Of course, it's a reaction to 9/11. So, Al-Qaeda on 9/11 attacks the United States from their sanctuary in Afghanistan. And then we go and say to the Taliban, hand them all over. And the Taliban, the government of Afghanistan, says, no, we're not going to cooperate. And then we're at war with the Taliban. And honestly, I think that the initial war was brilliant. 88 days to Kandahar, using just a couple special operations forces along with indigenous people to run the Taliban out of Afghanistan, and of course air power. A brilliant campaign. Once that was done, though, we made the decision to occupy Afghanistan. And I believe that what we're trying to do is establish a friendly government allied to us and able to control its own territory. The theory being, hey, if there's a friendly government allied to us and able to control its own territory, then no terrorists will come back or be able to live and grow and prosper in Afghanistan, because this friendly government allied to us with the ability to control its territory will take care of them. And so I believe that's what we were going for. Now let's look at some of the assumptions behind that. First, sort of central government built top down would be effective in Afghanistan. There's no historical reason, cultural reason, geographical reason, if you look at the terrain of Afghanistan, to believe that a central government is going to be able to effectively control Afghanistan, or that we would be able to effectively build a central government from the top down. I think it's a horrible assumption, and that thorough study of the situation, thorough calculations in accordance with master-son standard could have given us that foreknowledge ahead of time. Second, building a military in our own image. So for that government to control Afghanistan, they have to have a capable military, and so we built them one, and we did it in our own image by taking all these different people from all parts of Afghanistan, bringing them together, making them part of a national army, and then sending them to whatever part of Afghanistan needed them. And that works well for the United States. That's what we do. That's what most Western militaries do. But there was an era in our history, if you look at Civil War records, World War I records, even some World War II, that we built military units based on just local people. That local towns and areas would raise their own regiments, and a unit of the United States Army would just be all local people from that. It's one of the reasons the 82nd became so famous in World War II, is the All-American Division brought from all parts of the country, as opposed to other units that were just from one small part of the country. So that's sort of an aside, but that model, the model of bringing all different tribes, ethnicities, and geographical parts of Afghanistan together did not work. Today, the Afghan National Defense Security Forces sort of messed it up a little bit, but the Afghan army is still ineffective, as evidenced by the fact that a non-state actor, the Taliban, routinely defeats them and is giving them a run for their money. So if you look at it, hey, all the training, the weapons and equipment, all those factors should firmly indicate that the Afghan National Army would defeat the Taliban because they have advantages to all that, except that they don't have the morale. I mean, they don't have the will to fight vis-a-vis the Taliban, and that's because we built them in our own Western image. Okay, and the last assumption, Pakistan. So this is really maybe better entitled Pashtunistan. Pashtunistan is the eastern part of Afghanistan and the western part of of Pakistan, and the Taliban is a Pashtun-based movement. And so the Pashtun people, like that line that divides Afghanistan and Pakistan, doesn't mean anything to them. I mean, they intellectually know it's there, but they don't care. The Pashtun people flow back and forth. That's all historically Pashtunistan, so they don't care about that. And we should have, the fact that the Taliban's been able to have a safe haven throughout the entire war in Pakistan has really made this war unwinnable for us. And through calculations, proper calculations beforehand, I think we should have absolutely understood that and either, just understood that and done something different. So 3 things that we did in this war, the good calculations based on real intelligence. If we had lived up to Master Sun's standard that he wrote 2,300 years ago, we could have avoided some of the major issues with the Afghanistan war. So I think Master Sun would give the United States and the United States military a very poor critique in this regard, and professional officers in the U.S. military should really take this to heart. Okay, well, that concludes my little Afghanistan analogy, so I will now conclude. Okay, references. Of course, the primary reference is The Art of War. I take a look at all 3, well, not all 3, there's probably more, but the 3 translations I use are Giles, Ames, and Griffith, so I'll use all those translations. And then the article that I quoted from was by Ron Suskind. And then finally, I want to just do a little bit of a sort of a shout out. I didn't really use this as a reference, but I want to mention The Art of War for D&D Players by M.T. Black. And my point here is to say, hey, Master Sun, congratulations. 2,500-ish years after you lived, 2,300 years after The Art of War was written, you have arrived. It is now a reference for Dungeons & Dragons players everywhere. Okay, so my mission here at the Basement War Room is to preserve the lessons of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. If you would like to join me in this mission, then please do join the Facebook group, Lessons of the Afghanistan and Iraq Wars. And if you'd like to go a little bit deeper behind and see the inside workings of the Basement War Room, then sign up for the newsletter at thebasementwarroom.com. Thank you very much for joining me in this last talk on The Art of War. And next time we'll jump into Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War.